uh, when going over it, oh, hey, Mark, when you go over it, might be a little bit abbreviated tonight. Um, and I'm the only one at home, and I may have trick or treaters, so I may have to get up and uh, interrupt it every couple minutes. But what I highly recommend is go through the material in the module, click on all the links, look at all the different articles, and that will really help quite a bit in kind of fleshing this out. And there's a couple articles that I think are really good. I have like maybe 4 or 5 up there that are really good, and we'll talk about that. Before we get into that, I wanted to talk about a couple other things. First off, did you guys have a good week? Kind of. Okay. Good.
Yeah, I had a good week.
You guys aren't in jail, so that's a good sign. That's positive and hopeful. Now, I do want to mention tomorrow night. That's Friday night. Is the Art Connect in Southern Utah. That is at the St. George Museum of Art, and Van Magnus is going to be presenting. So definitely do what you can to get there because it should be really interesting. And I'll give you an exact time. Let's see. Give me a. It is from 5:30 to 7. Again, that's at the Museum of Utah or the St. George Art Museum. It's really good, and if you bring a piece of your own artwork during the hour and a half, you can vote on people's artworks, and by common voting, they will pick 3 different artworks, and your stuff will be in a gallery for a month. You know, a legit gallery, which is really nice because if you're looking for gallery representation, that can be a really good introduction to some of the possibilities that are out there. You notice that I've spent literally seconds on my costume today. This is my Guy Fieri wig hat. My wife has one that matches her hair color as well. Uh, my kids invited us all last Halloween to go on the Park City ski lift for Halloween night, and that was a lot of fun. And we were all dressed up as different versions of Guy Fieri, whatever. The guy that I think he's like a chef or something. And like that, one of the kids was a zombie version. One of the kids was a stripper version of Guy Fieri, which was really uncomfortable. Like, just uh, not for me. All right, today, and I wanted to talk about something else too. I've I've gone through and Sunday night I had responded all to all the emails and stuff that I had gotten, and I hadn't looked back until today. And so if you uh, hadn't gotten a response when you sent it in on Sunday, like late night or whatever, I did respond. And most people, I think their projects are really good. And I would say a couple things. A couple people, I don't think they communicated very well about what they wanted to do. And so I just asked for some clarification. If you haven't done that yet, please do it as soon as you possibly can. I will be checking uh, for those. And in order to get points for this, what you need to do is communicate with me. And a couple people talk to me just after our class period, and we talk through their project. And the way you submit that is either submit copies of the emails back and forth until I get to the phrase like that sounds great, go ahead and do it, or I say um, get started or go for it. And most of the time that's going to be you tell me it's the email chain that where you say what your project you want to do, then I say that would be really good, but you need to watch out for these things tied into the class, make sure it fits the time parameters. And you say, okay, I will be happy to do that. And then I respond with, it sounds great, go for it. And you just copy all that into something and submit that. People have done that with a screenshot and other things. A couple of people tried to send me Google Docs. I don't do Google Docs. It's not compatible with the computer system that I have, with the what's it called? With the what's the word? My electronical doohickey interface thing. When I'm working with Canvas, there's just too many hoops to jump through for me to access the Google Docs, and I will not edit your proposal if it's in Google Docs. I won't do that. I'll ask you to make changes, then you make the changes. If that's what you did, oh no, it's a security thing. My online security protocols will not allow me, without going through an awful lot of hoops, to interact too much with Google Docs for whatever reason. But if that's the case, an easy way for you to get that information to me is do a screenshot and send me a PDF, or copy it into a Word document. And again, I won't edit your proposal. I will ask you to make changes if changes are needed. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. And so when you turn the final thing in, it is either going to be an image that's a screenshot of our conversation, or a document that is our conversation, where you are telling me what you're doing and you're getting my response. And then if changes are necessary, you're committing to the changes. All right. Those are and then the last thing is I say, yeah, go ahead. Those things are really vital to do. And the reason why we're doing this is, I think I shared with you in the document description, I was in a philosophy class and I thought I just knew everything. And so for the final project, of course, I waited until 3 hours before the deadline to turn it in. And I had done something that I thought was brilliant. And I got a C on it, which was devastating. The guy said, well, I should have given you an F because it didn't fill any of the parameters of the assignment. And it's too late for us to talk about it because it was due. And but I wanted to give you some credit because you did something on it. And so that was, I don't want that to happen. Last semester, out of the 5 classes that I taught, each of those classes had at least 1 to 5 people that submitted a project that couldn't fit in the parameters of the class because it wasn't covering any of the course material that the class outlined. Which for this class 2710, it has to be directly related, and you have to introduce it as being directly related to art and architecture before the year 1350. Right? I know I've gone over this several times, but I just want to make it really clear. Is that clear for everybody, what that thing entails? And this preliminary assignment is necessary to make sure that you don't spend 10 hours doing something that won't count for credit, because I don't want that. That's a waste of your time. I think one person last year taking the 2710 class did a whole project reproducing some of the Impressionist paintings, and was really irritated that they didn't get any credit for it because that was the 2720 class, not the 2710 class. So, blah, 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 dead horse, meet the stick. Okay. Does anybody have any plans for Halloween after we're done with this class?
Been thinking about getting my scary mask and hiding behind bushes and charging at people with it.
I don't think that's a good idea, especially in Utah where people have concealed carry permits.
Yeah, true, but it is the day for scares.
Yeah, that is true. But there was about 6 years ago, there was a guy that was killed. Was dressed up as Michael Myers, and he had a butcher knife, and he was just going around um, a forest park near where he lived, uh, growling at people with it. And it was a real knife. And the last person he growled at and tried to scare had no idea that he was just clowning around, and actually shot him 4 times and killed him. So be very careful. If
Yeah,
you're at a haunted house attraction, then that's okay. If you're going to be haunting a construction site, there's crews still on the ground, I would rethink it.
and it is more of a joke, a half joke suggestion idea. Like,
Okay, good.
but yeah, I will keep that in mind. Thank you, Professor.
All right, now what we are going to be talking about next is for the rest of the term, we are going to be jumping around a little bit, just like we have been doing. There is, during the Enlightenment, there was a conceit that everything in the universe led to the white male in Europe, and he was the peak of evolution. And for a long time, everything that didn't fit that paradigm was considered primitive or a fluke, which is pretty sad. And I know we've talked about this before, especially with like the Ife and the Yoruba-based civilizations. What we're going to be talking about today deals directly ties into European history, but I think next week we're going to be looking at other stuff, and the rest of the term we're going to be looking at stuff going on in Japan and in North America as well, just kind of the art that was going on there. So just be prepared for that. For the next month or so, we're going to be jumping around a little bit. Now this is a map of the Crusades. The the Catholic Church had very powerfully established itself, if not outright political leaders. It was an open secret that they were the enforcing power behind a lot of thrones in Europe and in many places. This this meant that instead of just saving souls, the Catholic Church was also in charge of feeding them, which, or at least they oversaw, taking care of people's physical needs. And there was a certain amount of uh, desire for income, uh, to be honest about it. When people had too many independent thoughts, there was also a need for things like retrenchment of ideas and ways to focus people's energies. And today, I think a lot of churches have very wisely gone back to their root scriptures and inspired people to really step up their service to those around them. At this time, I don't know exactly why or what went into the decision making, but it was resolved that a good way to kind of help control uh, how people dealt with things. This is really broad and it's all anecdotal. It's just from my observation. It just and does seem consistent. I'd be willing to bet that 99% of everybody in any church are really, really powerfully decent people. Uh, the sad thing is, it only takes one strong person in a position of authority to screw things up for a lot of people. And for whatever the decision, whatever response to the decision was made to start enlightening people in the Middle East with the gospel of peace and love by any means necessary, which St. Francis got it. I mean, he understood immediately that you do not preach a gospel of love at the tip of a sword. And one of the ongoing problems is too that people of any religion should not feel obligated to lay down themselves and serve themselves up as victims either. You know, if you're the not the aggressor, I think it's human right to be able to defend yourself. But in this case, what we're talking about is people in Europe, uh, more often than not, just leading completely normal human lives, being told that God wanted them to go to the Holy Land, which is this area here, and uh, forcibly retake it for the Christians. And by the Holy Land, primarily we're talking about biblical sites and Jerusalem. Now, there is a huge problem with that right away that I hope you guys see. Remember when we talked about the Muslims coming into Jerusalem? The people in Jerusalem, how did they view the Muslims that were coming in? Do you guys remember this? What was the religion, the state religion of the people that ruled over Jerusalem at that time? I'll give you a hint. It starts with a Z. It was the Zoroastrians. And the Zoroastrian rulers were not following their own faith and were being kind of turds. And so when the Muslims came in around 690, they were seen as liberators. And what they did is they took over Jerusalem and wrested it from the control of the Zoroastrian government at the time, and immediately turned around and enforced laws to protect the religious worship of the three principal children of the book, to allow safeguards for the fourth children of the book, and then make it so that everybody else coming in felt quite a bit safer than they would in other places of the world. The children of the book are, it's primarily three groups and then a fourth one. And those three groups are Jews, Christians, Muslims, and the fourth one is the Sabbateans. And they are a lot of the times lumped in with the Jews, but they're not. They should not be considered Jewish in the same way as Jews are considered today. And so, what is the problem when Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem? A big problem was that Jerusalem was already liberated. Christians, Jews, and Muslims were all living together just like in any other ordinary city. I mean, they were fine. Over the next 400 years, there's lots of sites around Syria and the outlying areas, past the confines of present-day Israel, where there were communities that are shown to have sacred homes for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, where their front doors are all facing each other, and they would support each other. This is also true in a lot of Eastern Turkey. There's really ancient towns that have that same kind of thing that was really lost under Ataturk rule. But and that's one of the reasons that make me think that there was a lot more going on than just Pope Urban saying, "Hey, God told me to do this." That's why I think there's a lot of political motivations, because if the people are fine and God knew that a lot of harm and pain would be caused by these guys going in, it probably wouldn't have been done. But I'm just saying that, completely my own opinion. I want you to watch this video. It talks about the First Crusade. And at this time in Europe, at 1095, almost everybody was born, lived, and died within 12 miles of their home. Can you imagine that? And most of the time for traveling, you would be walking next to, if you were lucky enough to have a horse, you would be walking next to a beast of burden, and you're not walking particularly fast. You're probably going to be covering maybe 8 miles a day at top speed. So consider that thousands of people were called, and in their minds, those who participated were called, legitimately called by God to go and do this. So they thought they were doing the Lord's work. And they traveled, what is that, about 3,500 miles from Europe to Jerusalem and back again. And a lot of the times they would be going through Turkey, where they would see in Byzantium the Roman Empire, that was established there, where this was a land that was ruled by a Christian family that allowed for and supported the cross-pollination and cohabitation of a lot of different faiths. And then they would go down, go from there into Jerusalem. But one of the main reasons why the Crusades are important is because of the fact that it was a forced cross-pollination. Music changed, storytelling changed, clothing style changed, armory changed, the way horses were ridden. Tremendous advances were taken in both transportation technologies. This is where the Knights Templar were started, and this is where the first widespread use of essentially online security systems were used. It was by the Templars. They used codes to so that you could deposit your money in Germany with a Knights Templar. He would give you a coded message to take with you. When you got to Turkey, you would give that coded message to somebody, and they could decode it and give you the exact amount minus their usage fees that you had deposited in with them in Germany. And it was all incredibly secure, with codes that there's actually a couple cases of books today using those codes that still people haven't been able to crack, which I think is really fascinating. So people were traveled more than themselves, every member of their family for the last 3 generations all put together had, and then going back home as they survived. They were forced to live with people that were completely different from them. They saw things that were completely different than anything they had ever imagined. Can you imagine growing up where the largest building you had ever seen was the 15-foot tall spire of the church in the middle of town? And then you see a building in Istanbul, which is so big, the Hagia Sophia, that every once in a while the clouds would form on the inside. I mean, it's mind-blowing, literally mind-blowing. And then people saw geometry and math. They saw ways of record keeping that nobody had ever thought of before. All these astounding, amazing things that were just not even blips on the radar. And I want to share just an overview of a couple of these articles that I've attached with you or for you. You guys recognize this. It is a Crusader-based castle, but this technology was developed by these people going into lands where they just assumed everybody hated them. And the technology was developed to keep the people safe and to keep the guards of trade routes safe. And what is really fascinating is this kind of engineering has informed every other building that the West has had anything to do with for the next 1,000 years. And you start noticing all these little things Right here, the dental molding to hide the oubliette shoots. You have the crenellations at the top here, really, really heavy walls. And at the base, a lot of the walls will slope out. These things are incredibly sturdy. Now, you don't have a lot of gunpowder being used in warfare at this time. What you do have are things like trebuchets and catapults. Trebuchet is like a catapult, but it uses lever technology rather than elastic technology. So the kinetic energy being released is being released through release of a counter lever. And you get these stones that could be as big as a table, weigh maybe half a ton to a ton. They would fly through the air as fast as you could shoot a bullet from a slingshot. And these walls are built to withstand this kind of thing. And you recognize that in like Mad King Ludwig's Neuschwanstein, which is that is the castle that is that inspired all the Disney movies. The clip at the beginning, that's the Disney castle. And but that's where we get our idea today of Camelot and palaces and things like that are from these things. I think this was third or fourth crusade is where this comes from. And this has maps of where people were going, who controlled what, where things were. This is the Western Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire. This is where the Roman Empire that Charlemagne really helped to establish. Then this is the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire that Constantine really established. And then all this area is controlled. It says controlled by Muslims, but that was the majority of the governments was run by Muslim leaders. And this goes through and gives you some of the history of the Crusades. And what is fascinating to me about the Crusades, and there's a lot of things to read here and look at, is we start seeing art that celebrates the pious martial servant of God. So, it's celebrating people in armor and who abide by the codes of chivalry and a very specific style of dress. There's heraldry that really grew big at this time, so that when you had a large force of people on the field, you could identify who friends and foes were. But the other big thing that happened was crests for clubs or orders were really developed, and a lot of consistency was followed through, so that if you were a Hospitaller or a Templar, you could see across the field where your buddies were and make your way to them if you got separated. And like I said, there were standards. We know how these people dressed in large part because it was important to the people creating art at the time to demonstrate how they were dressed, because this was considered very much so a practical application of Paul's sermon of putting on the armor of God. This is what it was viewed for, even through the designs of the swords. You can't see it too well here, but this is a Crusader sword. We have a pommel with a gem or something of the sort inscribed in that little dooley whacker right there. And you have a handguard that goes at right angles to the line established by the pommel all the way to the blade, because a Crusader, in their mind, that was their cross that they would carry. They would have the blade down and grip it by the handle when they would pray, and that would be their crucifix that they could use while in the field. And this kind of architecture has a lot of reflection from the Roman style arches and things like that, mixed in with other things like that pointed arch, and you kind of see that here. And what is really fascinating to me is you do. This is a mosque. This is a Muslim mosque, But you'll look at some of the Christian work that is done at about the same time, and there's a lot of similarities. This was uh, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt at about the same time as the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built, and there do seem to be some structural similarities. I just think that that's really interesting. You look at this, um, and you look at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and there are some interesting things. So it looks to me like the architects were talking to each other. And then I included a couple things about why the Muslims see the Crusades very differently from Christians. Today, a crusade, when we use the word crusade as a Christian, it is ubiquitous with a person moving forward with power and integrity, believing they are doing so in the cause of justice or rightness. And the word crusade is actually a cognate uh, um, use of the word cross, and it's a reflection on cross and Christianity, with the idea being that a crusade was a military exercise design or military campaign designed to liberate Christians on one hand and to bring the knowledge of Christ back to the areas that had been overrun by Muslims. And what's really horrific, I think, is in 1096, when the Christians arrived in Jerusalem, they had a very hard time telling who the Christians were, who the Jews were, and who the Muslims were because of that cross-pollination of culture, and people were killed indiscriminately. It didn't matter. And there's one documentation states that somebody high up in the church said, well, if they were true Christians, they would have liberated it for us anyway. So it's not harm to kill them because they've already denied their salvation. And which I think is just a really terrible way of looking at the world. But that's, it's really very easy to look at things and make judgments after the fact. I wasn't there. We didn't live through it. We don't know what people were like at that time. Uh, there are what is interesting to me is that there is a lot of conversation too about how many crusades there were. Very definitely go through this module, that first part of the module, and watch those videos that talk about what the crusades were, what was going on, and everything. Some people say that there were 5, some people say there were 6. There were 9 major crusades, and there were a bunch of little small ones, and some really, really tragic ones. There were a couple of crusades of volunteers where people were just asked to volunteer. God doesn't care that you can't fight. He just needs your presence there. And the volunteers would go, and if they did show up in any sort of military engagement, they'd be slaughtered because they felt very certainly that God would protect them. And so they didn't undergo any of the training that they really needed to. And that isn't mentioned in this. There's also 3 children's crusades, 1 main one and 2 smaller ones. This is particularly devastating. In any sort of situation where people aren't completely certain what's going on, there are going to be ruthless, nasty, evil people that rise up and take advantage of folks that are just trying to do the right thing. And so there were a few people that would go through, and there were some areas where the local church leaders thought this was a legitimate thing. And people were told, since children are innocent, God will work through them, and his angels will give them might and power to wrest the Holy Land back from the wicked people that have taken it. So please let us take your children with us, and they will liberate the Holy Land. And so local church leaders and a lot of pious families, children, there are heartrending stories of children emboldened by their faith saying, yes, I am happy to go. And then when they would get to a waterway and be put onto the boat, they would be whisked away and sold into slavery. And there are some really awful cases of this where, children from Europe were were marched from town to town to town till they got on a boat that held, several hundred kids, and then they were sold to families in China, Arabia, uh, North Africa, Eastern Africa, uh, and never saw their families again. So, a lot of stuff going on. That's enough tragic history, I think, for right now. But what I wanted you to be aware that a lot of stuff was going on. This Crusades period lasted for about 200 years, and it was all about, from the perspective of the people whose hearts were pure, it was they were thinking they were going to go liberate the home of Christ. And from people whose hearts were less than pure, which I'm absolutely certain was an extreme minority, these were opportunities to make money out of conflict. And it is really interesting that the Muslim perspective was very different. How do you think the Muslims were reacting with all these Europeans coming in and picking fights with them?
They're on the defensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is fascinating to me. There are, you guys know who Saladin is, don't you? Or does anybody not know who Saladin is? What's that?
I think I've heard of him.
Saladin, have you guys seen City of Heaven with, who's that? Orlando Bloom? That is a pretty good movie. I think it's about the Third Crusade, something like that, where about 95, 98 years after the First Crusade, the character played by Orlando Bloom, his father comes back into town. He was a crusader, and Orlando Bloom feels the spark to go and to his father's lands around Jerusalem. And it's very interesting because at this time Baldwin IV is the king of Jerusalem. He was played brilliantly by Edward Norton, where you never see his face. It's all either makeup or with mask on because Baldwin IV had leprosy. And even though Saladin was his sworn enemy, according to the Catholic Church, Saladin had the doctors, and he and Baldwin IV were friends. And Baldwin IV would make sure that Saladin could do what he needed to do peaceably. And Saladin made sure that Baldwin IV had all the best doctors treating his leprosy. And until the engagement got hot, and Saladin was supposed to take Jerusalem. But this kind of stuff back and forth happened all the time. But Saladin, even though he was a sworn enemy of the Christians, according to the church at the time, he was such a decent, noble, amazing person who really set the standard of all the highest conceits of chivalry, that for the next 60 years, the next 2 or 3 generations, people in Italy were naming their children after him because he was such a remarkable individual. And I think that's really amazing. But yeah, you're right. Muslims saw them as interlopers, picking fights. So now we're going to take a break from my ranting and look at some of the art of the Crusades. And of course, I just, that's so aggravating. I just accidentally X'd out the page I was trying to show you. Sigh. I really appreciate, even though I know that I am the only one who does that, I really appreciate you guys being so gentle with me and not getting mad when I do. Okay. 2710.
I think most of us have accidentally clicked off something that we needed.
Yeah, that's sweet of you to tell me. Even though I don't necessarily believe you, I still appreciate the sentiment. Okay. So we're going to. The other day I was right in the middle of stuff and I clicked the leave button, so the whole meeting was canceled, and that was a little bit embarrassing. Okay. Now, is there anything that we've seen recently that makes you that this reminds you of? Do you remember that the tapestry that we looked at that was just detailing the history of the Normans? This is about 250 years after that tapestry was made, but I think you can see a lot of what's going on artistically. Okay, we know that people knew the relative size of human beings to boats. So why are these human beings being shown 5 times bigger than they would be in real life?
Based on other, I'd guess to emphasize importance
Yeah,
or to emphasize what
absolutely.
they're doing.
Yeah, they want you to know there's a ship there, but the relative size of the ship is a lot less important than the human players. And then you look at these people; these guys are about a half the size of this guy right here, but they're in front of this guy, and we know very well that they knew that objects farther away appeared smaller. So this is called a social hierarchy, or it's also called hierarchical perspective, where the individuals that are deemed more important in a society are shown larger. We also saw that in the standard of We saw that in a lot of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian art we looked at. And this is a grown adult with his boat that he's rowing out into the ocean, and he's even smaller than these people, but both of these guys are adults. These are all soldiers in another boat, and all you can see is their helmets. So what's most important for the artist is that you get the idea of who the players are and their relative social standing, for the most part. That doesn't entirely hold up, because these soldiers should be bigger than the dock workers. But maybe what that's saying is that a lot of these dock workers may be soldiers doing menial tasks. And then you get the pleasant conscripts, the peasant conscripts are smaller than the knights. And I think stuff like that is really interesting to see. But the reason why I mentioned that tapestry, or that we looked at, is because notice that the heads and faces are very similar in the way that they're portrayed, and the costumes are similar but a little bit different. Some of the things that are important to note as well is that this is where we start seeing, during the Crusades, is where we start seeing the particular graphic art style that developed into heraldry. You know, every culture has standards of some sort that people come to. The two cultures that really come to mind as using a lot of heraldry, like we understand it, are the ancient Japanese and the Crusader culture in Europe. And that's where you see these standards, where it tells you exactly who are the families that are participating, who are the ones that are funding it, and who are the ones in the chain of command. And that's what these standards are for. We also can tell quite a bit about the technology used in the ships, even though we know that these are the shapes aren't right and the sizes aren't right. They aren't in that kind of perspective. we still have a pretty good idea of the kind of technology people used. And then this is the Met link that I have, where it has a lot of really very cool things. A couple of the things we'll just talk about it. This is a reliquary, and if you guys want, if somebody wants to do a project about reliquaries, that'd be awesome. A relic was something that was a tangible aspect of a holy life, or a life lived in a holy manner. There was a belief that if somebody was worthy and righteous enough, they could live their life so they could lay claim on the crucifixion of Christ and be saved. But if you lived righteously enough and were martyred, then there would be enough extra righteousness so that people could ask you to help them out. Maybe and ask God. You might have God's ear. Ask Him to use that extra amount of worthiness that you have left over and apply it to the great amount of grace or amount of worthiness that they need, so that they can receive grace as well. Which I think is a really interesting idea of the commodification of righteousness, which is not a new idea, and it's not necessarily a wicked idea either. We all have people in our lives that we feel might have some sort of intangible, numinous pull in the universe. For me, when I send glass off to an exhibit, I always have my kids pray for its safety, and it works every time. But for other people, maybe we have other folks, like having a grandparent or somebody else that we look up to. And a relic was a way of housing something tangible to either unite you with that kind of a saintly figure, or to connect you with something from the Holy Land, something from Scripture. And it wasn't necessarily a cult type of thing. More often than not, this was a reminder for everybody that participated in the veneration of relics. It was a reminder that people could succeed, that people could succeed in the spiritual realm, that people were worthy, that people did receive grace. And if that was true for them, it could be true of you as well. And so when we look at some of this artwork, the reliquary artwork, of course, you can see where today's like trophy designs, come into this. If we blow that image up, you'll see that there's a base here, and this is where we get that kind of design for modern day trophies, where you have a cup that's designed to be a container for something numinous. Numinous means not quite physical, just out of the realm of being able to be touched. And then you have a base for it as well. And that's the fundamental makeup of every trophy you've ever seen, has those things, and it's based on the reliquary culture. Sometimes you would have a piece of a true cross. You would have there are examples of seeds of the original apple that Adam and Eve ate. A lot of Christians were slaughtered by the late Western Roman Empire and buried in the catacombs. You've heard that phrase. Their bones were harvested and then sent to communities in Europe so they could have that tangible connection with people that had made it, that were died martyrs, and it kind of inspired their faith. This is where you get very symbolic carving, and you see the cross form. This is a double cross. You see a cross form, and then you also see this kind of floral form, which is very interesting because it combines the four ends of the cross. This is, I believe, does anybody know, is this an St. Andrew's cross that's an X? It's because a Peter's cross is upside down. And then at the end, the termination of each of the four arms, you have these three petals that represent reminder of the Trinity. And then here's a pommel that has the coat of arms of the person who commissioned the sword. You have stained glass in Europe really started taking off at about this time, and there was a lot of veneration of gospel stories. It was called typology, where people would show gospel stories out of the Old Testament and the New Testament that you would be asked to remember could inform your own life. So, they knew that people didn't wear these kinds of clothing, this kind of stuff, during the time of the Bible stories. And you would have like King Louis the Ninth participating in a Bible story as if he was alive at that time. They knew that. They would just show people in contemporary clothing so that you could put yourself into the story and see yourself as a participant in that gospel story. This is a puxis, which is, again, just a prestige item, a decorative box. And a lot of the times you'll see a principal metal. In this case, it's brass, and it will be inlaid with silver, leafed with gold, inlaid with little pieces of ivory and things like that. What's fascinating to me is that you'll look at some of these forms, like this shape right here, and this lotus type flower, and you see these people where their figures almost look like calligraphy. What kind of work does this remind you of? What kind of culture does this remind you of? We talked about it last week, and we saw it a little bit earlier than that.
Or reminds you of like Ottomanish?
Yeah, it looks like the Muslim type work. And at this time, a lot of these things were being made for Christian audiences by Muslim artisans. And so they would have these kinds of arabesque lozenge shapes, and they would be informed by a lot of the lines that were used in Arabic calligraphy, because that's what the artist knew. And so you get these really interesting designs that fuse together a couple different perspectives. And this is also the height during the Crusades. This is the height of the votary death sculpture, where it'd be a portrait of the person whose family sponsored the chapel or whatever it is. And it would be a depiction of them, in the best light, usually with their coat of arms or with symbols of stories associated with their lives. And you would see that carved into this the sarcophagus lid, which of course was also something that was very heavily informed by experience that a lot of these people had when they would go through Egypt, on the way back home or onto the sites that they were going to. Stuff like this, I think, is really amazing, because this is made. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is basically it's Christian. This is one of the Christian kingdoms of Jerusalem. So there's a lot of Christian iconography in this imagery. But, looking at this is kind of reminiscent of some of that Celtic stuff that we saw. And it's also very reminiscent of some of the older Islamic work that we saw with those vegetal designs that Muslim artists used. And what is really amazing to me about these carvings, again, you have things where these people may only be 8 or 9 inches tall, but there's a lot of detail, and the architecture is distorted. You have, these are called crenellations right here. These are designed on a castle wall during the Crusader times. They were employed to protect the people behind them, and the person would crouch or stand behind these, use these areas in between the crenellations to shoot out, and then duck back behind. So, of course, the architecture here is not to scale to the human figures. The architecture is there to just represent that this takes place in a Crusader's castle. They they are not intending for it to be realistic. That was never the intent. It was kind of this distorted architecture to symbolize that the architecture was there. Now, if we look at this is a gospel book from this time. The art is a little bit less delicate than during we saw in the Carolingian Renaissance, a lot more simple. I think a big part of that is because of the tools people had access to. And if this was done during the Crusades in an area that was constantly fraught by war, then the artists wouldn't be in a protected space like they would have been in a monastery under the Charlemagne's protection. So you wouldn't have that same level of artistry simply because you don't have the time. But each of these different ideas, the ways that these people are portrayed, it seems to me that they saw other artwork. They encountered other artwork that they were informed by. Whose artwork do these eyes make you remind you of?
Byzantine?
Yeah, very much so. And you have the distorted long body. So that they're thinking of that as perhaps as they're doing this artwork, but it is quite a bit more simple. And we don't see that this was embellished with gold leaf and stuff because this is almost 1,000 years old, and a lot of that type of stuff is going to wear away. Now, you look at artwork that is done by somebody who could take the time, and there's a lot more detail. And it's just astounding. And again, you have these implausible architectural structures, not because people didn't know what they were doing, but because it's more important to show the Annunciation of Gabriel and Mary than it is, and for you to recognize who those players are, taking place in an architectural space, and a lot less important for you to see that everything, the architectural space was rendered with perfect geometric perspective. Now this I think is absolutely fascinating. It reminds me a lot of the Name style books that were done by the Persians and people in India, which is fascinating to me. And this is Christian. I don't know if we've talked about the books. That's something that usually is considered to be concurrent with the Renaissance, so a little bit later. But it was something that the tradition started about 100 years before the Crusades, and there were these Name style books that were in wealthy families that were held by wealthy families in Turkey. So it wouldn't surprise me if this artist came across that kind of style of book. And then you look at something like this. This is Crusader art as well, and we have the halo demonstrating that this person is a saint, and Saint Bernard. It wouldn't surprise me if the cat had something to do with his story, if that was part of his aspect, so that everybody would know who this was. But you look at, there is a very significant difference in portrayal and craftsmanship from this to this. So I would say that this is probably going to be towards the end of the Crusades, and it's probably going to be produced by an artist that was sheltered, that wasn't part of the on-site ongoing military programs, as well as this, because it looks like they had the time and safety to really go at it. That horse looks really pissed off. Now, this body does seem to be a little bit distorted on the order of that distortion that we saw with the Carolingian work. And it's interesting to me. Maybe it was more important to the artist to demonstrate that this was a knight on horseback than to get all the anatomy right. But it is fascinating to me how much detail they have in the horse's face, how much detail they have here, how much in the hands. The body does, this, if you saw a person like this walking next to you, you'd probably want to invite them to play basketball on your team because this person looks like they would be incredibly tall. Now, the standard warhorse of the time was several hands shorter than most horses that we're familiar with today. They were short, they were squat, but the anatomy of this animal does not seem to be quite appropriate, kind of like that distortion that we saw with the Carolingian work. And then you get this. This looks to me like much later work that is referencing the Crusades, because these bodies, this looks to me more like high Renaissance era work, just because of these kind of references and these kind of details. But it is work that references stories from the Crusades. And then you see some architecture that it was done at the time of the Crusades. I think a lot of that stuff is really interesting. So go through and check out, these kinds of things. Definitely go and check this out, Sultan and the Saint film. Did I tell you guys about Saint Francis of Assisi and what he did? Because that's the saint that Sultan and the Saint film is referencing. And let's see if we can. I'll give you some background, and we talk about some of the buildings and some of the arts that were really prevalent at the time. But I'm going to go back to the previous page and just reference this really quickly. We're not going to watch the video associated with this, but what is really amazing to me is during the time of the Fifth Crusade, so we're talking maybe 100, 150 years after the First Crusade, there was a guy named Frank or Francis who grew up in Italy. And as different regional church authorities were trying to drum up business for another crusade, he was really kind of unattached to a lot of that kind of godly stuff that was going on. And Francis, at this time in Italy, a lot of people made their bones as young men by going off to war. Different city-states would have these very established battles with each other to try to gain territory. And it wasn't with the intent of slaughtering everybody on the other side. It was with the intent of capturing them. Because then you could take the person that you captured and sell them back to their family. You would keep them in a prison cell and then sell them back to their home. And what this ended up being was creating a culture of the where rival towns would fight each other. You would go to battle for glory in hopes that maybe you get a name for yourself. If there's a crusade on again, you could go and get more glory, more power. But more often than not, what it meant was that if you lost, you'd be put in prison until your family could afford to buy you back. And St. Francis's dad was kind of pissed off at him, let him languish for a significant amount of time, and he ended up getting dysentery, which is just really nasty diarrhea. And it humbled him. This article is really good because it talks about a lot of the things that happened either during the Crusades or at the time of the Crusades. And this is background information about the Sultan and the Saint film. But what it comes down to is after St. Francis was released from prison, his dad bought him back. He took the church seriously and studied as much as he could, lived a Christian life, gave away all that he could so that he could be piously poor. And then when he found out that the Fifth Crusade was going on, he wanted to be involved, not to rally the troops, not to cause more grief for anybody, but he knew that if the gospel was a true gospel and that Christ really could influence people, if he was able to have an opportunity to talk to the Sultan of Cairo and have a one-on-one conversation, he would be able to convince him of the validity, the veracity of the gospel of Christ, and the conflict could be ended without more bloodshed. And he went to the Mediterranean with his best buddy, and they just started trying to find the shores of the Mediterranean. They would try to find a ship that would take them across. Finally, somebody would say, "Yeah, we'll take you." They sailed over to Egypt, and when he landed there, Brienne, not Brienne of Tarth, that's a completely different set of TV shows, but Brienne of France was the general of the crusading forces. And St. Francis asked for permission to go and talk to the Sultan of Cairo, uh, um, Al-Kamil, Malik Al-Kamil. And he knew that he could just explain, and and this was this intelligent person. He would talk about the gospel, and the guy would be converted to Christianity. Well, at this time, the Sultan was sweating because he did not want to. It looked like he was going to lose this battle if it was going to come to a conflict, but he knew Egypt. Does anybody know what happens at a very regular interval in Egypt to the Nile, and why it made Egypt so successful?
It floods, and the flooding helps. Flooding adds some fresh fertility to the farmland around it, and that's what made Egypt successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so what the Sultan did was basically entice the Christian forces to come towards Cairo and camp on the shores of the Nile right before the flood season. And he was hoping he could keep them there and swoop in and kill them all when Nile flooded and they were trapped in the mud. So he was kind of scared that the cardinal that was over the Christian forces wanted them to go in and take Cairo and loot the city, because that would give them him success as a crusader leader and give them the money to move forward to Jerusalem. And Brienne was scared that his men were going to get killed. He didn't want to be the leader of a lost cause. So St. Francis shows up. The cardinal says, "Sure, go let him, because he'll get." And the cardinal even wrote later that he thought maybe that Francis would get killed, so that they would have a martyr that would inspire the Christian troops to take Cairo. So Francis went with his best buddy. The guards, the Muslim guards, were kind of baffled that this unarmed Christian guy walking barefoot would want to talk to their king, and after harassing him for a while, word came back that the Sultan would see him. And what's interesting, in the context of the world at this time, a crusade involved soldiers that represented all the families of Europe, all the families of all the Christian families of Turkey, and they were going up against representatives of all the big Muslim families and clans of Northern Africa and the Middle East. Essentially, for all intents and purposes, this was the Fifth World War, for this time period. The Fifth Crusade was. And when St. Francis came to meet Malik Al-Kamil, they had their first conversation lasted for a couple hours. And Malik Al-Kamil was so used to the derogatory derisiveness of the Christians that he was shocked that a man would be treating him with respect. A Christian would be treating him with respect. He was astounded with how gentle and intelligent Francis of Assisi was. And St. Francis, for his part, he wasn't a saint yet, But for his part, he was astonished by how intelligent and well read the Sultan was. And they became friends. In that first 2 hour conversation, they became friends, and the crusade was ended for all intents and purposes. Now Malik's only concern was how can we get out of this military confrontation. He wasn't interested in slaughtering anybody or anything. He was just interested in getting out of the military confrontation. So what happened is St. Francis stayed there ostensibly as a hostage, but there just so that they could continue their conversation. And the Sultan had troops in readiness. So when the Nile actually did flood, all the Christian troops got diarrhea almost immediately. Their horses were up to their chest in mud. People were sick. They had no food. All their food had gone bad because it was infested with this nasty river water that was so good for fields but not good to drink. And the gates of Cairo opened, and all of the Sultan's forces charged out, in their full armor and might. And Brienne said that he thought for sure they were going to die. What they did was they were charging out with doctors, medicine, and food. They helped get the horses out of the mud. They fed the troops. They treated them with the medicine they needed. And the Sultan said, please take this food, take this medicine, and go peaceably back to the Mediterranean and go home. We don't want to fight you. And later, Brienne wrote, never had he seen such Christian charity exhibited by any human being that he had ever met other than the Sultan of Cairo. And the Sultan of Cairo, Malik al-Kamil, was the epitome of Christ-like charity. So it completely destroyed the cardinal's plans for another crusade, and he ended up dying in just a completely unpretentious monastery in the Alps somewhere. That's how he ended up his life. And I thought it was fascinating that St. Francis was such a Christian. He behaved in a Christian manner to everybody and everything. And in a 2 hour conversation ended a world war. He ended the Fifth Crusade. I think that's amazing. Now, what is astounding to me as well is you look at the impact of the Crusades and what that had in Christian art and architecture. There's an awful lot that's going on. Like we said, we talked about code keeping. This is where military codes were used quite a bit. And you have cipher codes, you have rebus codes, lots of really interesting things going on. You have different military orders that were started where monks became hospitallers and Templars. You have a very different perspective on political expansion, and you start seeing a lot of artwork that's inspired with Christian iconography, but is done by Muslim artists. And then as people returned home, they brought back a lot of this new knowledge that they got. And so it would have really been startling if the Crusades had not led directly to the Renaissance, which of course they did. And we can see really quickly some of the different kinds of artwork that people produced. This talks about Crusader art and architecture. And I want to share some of the military or some of the culture of the Crusades, what kind of art was developed. Of course, we looked at this. The Crusader architecture this is where we get the standard model of the European castle. With these kind of walls, these kind of turret towers. We also have crenellations at the top to be used for people to hide behind. And then we have this kind of reverse dental molding. Does anybody know why this is called dental molding? What does it look like?
Like teeth?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's called dental molding. And then we also see a lot of, I want to show you more than just this one example. Let's see if this will show up. And you can really see how related this architecture is. So we have these crenellations at the top. That's what those are called. We have the same kind of heavy duty walls. Now this is designed as a church. It's not designed as a redoubt or a castle. And so, that's why you have the windows on the walls, where if this was an actual palace or castle, you wouldn't have any windows for, several stories. Then this is in Accra. Um, you see these kinds of arches. This is a Christian structure, but it's heavily influenced by that Muslim style peaked arch. And again, you have the really heavy walls, and you can't see it from this view because a lot of it doesn't survive, but it did have the crenellations on the outside. And here again, you see the crenellations at the top. This is in Rhodes, in Greece, and then you have the reverse dental molding. And what's interesting to me, or the dental elements here, what's interesting to me, that was so that when people would use the toilet, they would have something to sit on, and it would go down the outside because they figured people wouldn't want to attack and climb through the mud. But also, you could pour things like burning tar and oil and boiling stuff on people that were attacking, which is just miserable and horrible. This is the castle of horses or horse riders, the Croix de Chevalier. Um, you see, this looks very similar to this other church. Let's see if I can find it again. Because it is the same one. But you'll see this is in. There's a lot of ruins, but you still see that kind of peaked arch. You see a little bit of echo of those really heavy protective walls. This has some of the suggestions of that Roman architecture, but this is a very Crusader influenced kind of structure. It looks almost like it was developed as a defensive battlement, even though it is a church. This is Saladin's castle, and this is very informed by the Crusader architecture. And you can see, again, you have echoes of those crenellations here. You have the heavy bases to the walls. You have those round turrety type structures along in the walls. There's really some interesting stuff. And this is another fort. It doesn't have a lot of those round areas, but you can see that those overhanging dental kind of forms here. And then you have the crenellations on the walls. The walls are pretty much solid without any windows, other than little teeny siding windows right there. And this is a castle. There's not an awful lot left to it. And this is actually a Muslim castle, but it looks very much the same, similar to a lot of that Christian stuff that we were looking at. So really, really fascinating things, how people started influencing each other. And there's some other castles and structures to look at. But we also, the book arts were really very powerful. And you can see a lot of stuff that's reminiscent of both Islamic art as well as the Celtic style work. A lot of those things really cross over. And then this is something that it looks like the Crusaders did have access to at some point. Or if not this exact book, a lot of similar stuff. And that earlier artwork that we looked at, it looks to me like there is some awareness of this style, if not this exact book. And I think it is really interesting to see some of those echoes. And then this is, I think it was Ryan that was working a little bit with Kufik. There was what's really fascinating to me is this talks about a little bit about an ornamental language. It's stylistic elements where the Christian artists had seen Kufic calligraphy and were trying to copy it without knowing how to read it. And so you see these calligraphy forms where they aren't necessarily forming actual letters. It's not even Cyrillic or anything, but the artist saw this kind of stuff, and so they put this ornamentation in some of the paintings that they were coming to. So this doesn't actually read as anything, but it's designed to look like that kind of calligraphy, which I think is really fascinating that the Christian artists came up with that. And I want you to look at some of this, listen to some of the music where it shows before the Crusades, reconstruction of some of that Carolingian style music during the Crusades. And then this is just to listen to some of the calls to prayer that I think might have informed some of that difference. Some of that difference also, music of the Crusades, you think about the instruments that you hear were a lot more easily made and more easily portable, which, if you're doing a lot of traveling, of course, the music that follows the military forces is going to, of necessity, require it be made by the instruments that they carried with them or could make in the field. And I think you'll hear a lot of flutes, cymbals, smaller drums, as well as like the precursors to guitars and viols, smaller things that people could carry with them. You're not going to hear an awful lot of organ music, for example, during the Crusades. Who knows who is, have any of you heard of Hildegard von Bingen?
She did that Nine Inch Nails sounding song, right? That
No.
taking the inspiration from.
That was Hildegard von Blingen, where she kind of plays off of Hildegard's name. But yeah, that's. Thank you for remembering that. I appreciate that.
Really me.
But Hildegard von Bingen is important for a couple reasons. This video, I'll have to find out why it worked for me earlier. It's not working now. And I think this does include a link where it will link you to YouTube and then you can watch the video, but I don't know why it's not showing. But Hildegard, she was a nun who came from a family of healers and very intelligent woman. She was trained. The equivalent today would be basically doctor training, medical professional training, as well as language training and very significant academic research training. So she was a brilliant woman. She could read and write in several different languages. And as she devoted her life to a godly life, she started having visions that incorporated a lot of the different things that she was very familiar with. And she started making paintings. So what is fascinating to me about Hildegard, one of her projects was collecting the traditional medicine that women had handed down from woman to woman. So she was basically started creating her own version of Gray's Anatomy, the tome that medical professionals refer to still today. That's about 700 years old. But her book was parallel to that, and that it collected the woman's healing knowledge instead of what we would recognize as traditional medicine. And so a lot of potions, a lot of healing treatments, poultices, how to make enses, how to make essential oils, this kind of thing. And she was an abbess. She also started receiving visions. So she was born right after the beginning of the First Crusade and died, I want to say, right around the time of the Third Crusade, something like that, Fourth Crusade. But she would hear things from the Pope. She would have a vision about how he was wrong. She would make paintings like this of her vision and write treatises and letters to the Pope telling him not only that he was wrong, but why he was wrong. She actually went and spoke to the Pope a couple times, and he found her to be incredibly intelligent, and more often than not, he listened to her. Remarkably brilliant. She pioneered the musical structure of the opera as we recognize it today. And she was a real visionary. So a lot of the imagery that we associate today with surrealism, you can see a lot of that. If you look up her paintings, her artwork, you can see a lot of that surrealist imagery because she was trying to portray the experiences that she was having in her dreams and visions in painting that other people would be able to recognize. And this isn't a period appropriate image. This was quite a bit later, but Hildegard von Bingen was really amazing, an amazing woman. Her herbology, medicine, and biology came because of her study of natural history, in collecting all of those records, the healing records that women had built. And what was really sad is as the church consolidated their power structures in a male hierarchy, the abbesses were abolished, and a lot of that information that she collected was distorted and misused in the Maleforum, or Maleforum, which was a book that was used to catch witches. So just really horrible. But while she was alive, she was super brilliant. She was a musician. She was a philosopher. Did a lot of writing, and it just in a time of the world in Europe when it seemed like many people prided themselves on being ignorant, she was a super genius. She was kind of like the Stephen Fry of her time. And so definitely watch these videos and listen to what she did and learn about her. This is one of her paintings in the background here. She was a proliferant. She was a proliferant. Proliferant? That's not the word. She did a lot of paintings. Is what I want to say, as well as poetry and a lot of other stuff. So that's an introduction to Crusader art. Go through the module, look at that kind of stuff. As you move forward, I will be, as I see emails and stuff like that throughout this week, I will be responding to them as soon as I can. If you need to talk to me directly, you have my cell phone number. You can text me, and we can set up a time so we can talk, or I can meet you on campus and we can visit. But I would like everybody to have, by the end of this week, the middle of next week, have that first part of the final project assignment completed, where you get your project description approved by me. Okay, please do that if you haven't already. And do we have any questions to round up this evening? Oh, and Ryan, when you listen to Hildegard's music, Hildegard von Bingen, I think named herself pretty well because she does it very much in the style of Hildegard von Bingen. So I completely appreciate your relative confusion there.
Well, that was a cool thing to run into.
It is really very interesting music. But there's about 6 people on YouTube right now that translate today's popular tunes into music of Carolingian and Crusader time, as well as Renaissance era sounding music. So very, very interesting stuff. But if there's no questions or anything, that's all I've got for you guys tonight. And I look forward to visiting with you next week. I am continually going through projects and stuff like that. If I haven't graded your stuff, just drop me an email and remind me. It looks like I'm getting the emails a lot more dependably if you just email me directly, as opposed to the Canvas thing. I do check that, but it doesn't seem to be refreshing as consistently as I need to. And I hear a knock on the door, so I've got to go and deliver treats to kids. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. I hope you guys have a wonderful Halloween, and I will look forward to seeing you guys later.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank
Halloween,
you.
everyone.
Have a good weekend.
All right, you too. We'll see you.